But the thing that I don't like, I'll repeat it, is that I don't like the Apple argument saying we don't need to overclock. Well, I'm sorry, if you're on Intel's architecture, you can make OS 10 run that much more faster.
Well, no, here's the thing. Like you're saying, OS 10 is linked to hardware, and so I'm not the biggest fan of OS 10 to begin with, and it's my problem. I've said it in other videos. I made a series of videos why I hate OS 10, and I get nothing but flack for them. But I put it out there. It's one of the things is I don't like what Apple, the lock-in factor Apple does to you. Even if OS 10 was my exact cup of tea, and I loved that GUI, because one of the things I don't like about it, I don't like that particular GUI. But even if it was my cup of tea and I love that GUI, I would rather go with the GNOME distro because I don't have the lock-in. I have that without the over lock-in. And until Apple gets rid of that, our way or the highway, our system that we've overcharged for or nothing, it's like I have absolutely zero interest in it at all.
Well, the thing of it is that I think it's not as widely known, and Linux is always going to be more of the preference model to suit. But a lot of people don't realize OS 10 is quite customizable. You have your own scripting language. You can make it do what you want. You can actually, I mean, even as a developer, you can attach certain things to EFI. The kernel is all, the underpinning kernel, not going as high as Cocoa, of course, and Core Foundation, is all open source and downloadable off the Apple websites. The thing of it is, it's just not marketed. But let me tell you, there's a lot of powerful things you can do through Terminal and AppleScript, and because Apple did come from, Apple used to really be the, back in the day, the Linux kind of crowd, if you will. You always had the knickknackers.
Well, no, and I get that, and I know I know what you're talking about. Like, you can go and run some scripts and edit. As a matter of fact, you can change the default search in Safari to whatever the hell you want by doing the script edit, like you're talking about, and so on and so forth. But it's one of those things. I feel like Apple went out of their way to make it not unlike the way Microsoft does the PAE kernel. I mean, not PAE kernel, but to fix the memory problem in Windows.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like even though it's capable of doing this, they deliberately do not want you, the end user, screwing with it. And in Linux, all these things, and that's the difference. That's the night and day difference between OS 10 and Linux, is that in Linux, you're encouraged to make the system your system. They made it easy. They made it right here in front of you. They didn't hide it under this, okay, go learn Unix. In the case of Linux, it'd be go learn Linux commands. They said, here it is, screw with it. We think it should be this way, but what do you think?
Is notorious. I mean, even to limiting how many cores are accessible via their software platforms. But let me say this, though, in defense of OS 10, I'm not aware of a whole lot of hardware artificial limitations. I mean, theoretically, OS 10 does go in scales as far as really what the Mac. The limiting point in the Macintosh is not OS 10.
It's the EULA.
Well, okay, a policy, yes. I can't run it on other PCs, and I argue against that. I mean, I know you have had debate videos with EMIC, but if you should look back at some of my historical videos, and EMIC responses to me and how I was declared an enemy, of Apple, and everybody should understand.
I wonder what he thinks of you now that you're working with me. Benedict Bit.
The days have changed since then. I mean, I think a lot of the Apple hardcores are not. They're not the same style as it used to be, because the arguments can't be made the same way it was back in 2007 and 2008. Too much has come to light, and a lot more geek-like arguments are coming to the surface to show the on-margin differences and saying, hey, wait a minute, get out of the worlds of sound bites and let's talk about real bits here. And the thing of it is that the limitation, let's say, for scale of 64-bit, OS 10 doesn't have a theoretical limit, other than what you would have in exabytes. Where you're stopped is when you hit the hardware. Well, the Mac essentially at some point stopped you at 32 gigs, and I think now some of them scale higher. I can't remember.
Well, no, it'll be interesting to see when the Mac Pros come out next month how they address that and what they go to, because that has always been one of the real limitations, that because you're limited for legal reasons, not for anything else other than the Apple EULA to whatever the heck Apple's going to sell you. And there have been some great, if you need something like a Mac Pro system, there have been good motherboards for this entire year and fourth quarter of last year that, DDR3 the way it should be, not the way Apple implements it, that go up to 48 gig with the 4 gig limit. And when 8 gig chips become cheaper and more efficient, all you need to do is flash your BIOS to make that 48 gig limit a 96 gig limit.
Well, you mean flash UEFI. I mean, BIOS is not capable of mapping anything higher than the 4 gig. I mean, by its own definition. I mean, Windows now uses UEFI on all 64-bit systems to map higher than 4 gigs. I mean, that was the reason why Apple long ago, they used the Linux version, I think, of a loader. It was, what was it, Open Firmware or something? Open something or other. And that was because it supported 64-bit level mapping. And when the G5 came out, in that architecture, the chipset itself needed to go beyond 4 gigs in terms of mapping everything within its system. So they had open firmware there. Now, EFI is an Intel thing. And so, of course, when they switched to the Intel architecture, they had to use the equivalent of being able to map out. So Windows is in the same category. They're not using BIOS to...
Well, no, what I mean is, if you were to... No, I mean on the motherboard. If on these motherboards right now, the reason they say up to 48 gig is because if you stuck an 8 gig DIMM in there, the system wouldn't recognize it.
In one bank, you mean?
In one bank, yeah.
Oh, well, then you're talking about, okay.
Yeah, and that's because they don't bank them that way right now. But theoretically, all of these systems, as long as there's a BIOS update to fix that, you can flash that in, and when that becomes commonplace, it will support the 8 gig DIMMs. This is something the average user won't do, but geeks like us, if it'll save us money, we'll probably look at.
But that would be a memory controller hub issue. I mean, if you're worried about memory density per bank, like one of the big reasons why I still prefer fully buffered architecture versus DDR3 is the density per page.
There you go.
Yeah, it's wrong. So you're telling that the firmware can be flashed to the memory controller now, which is part of the die in some of the Intel chips.
That's the thing. It would require upgrading other parts too, but right now, none of the consumer motherboards support 8 gig DIMMs. Only server motherboards support 8 gig DIMMs.
Sure.
And there's no reason for them to support 8 gig DIMMs right now because of how much they cost and everything else, and because of the CPU limitations and everything else. But it's inherently, it's not a hardware limitation on the motherboard, it's a software limitation from the BIOS, which it's assuming we're still using the same pin set and everything else, you could fix that at that point.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't see that happening anytime in the next 5 years, just because we need 2 more cycles of, I want to say, Moore's Law for the 8 gig memory to get cheap enough. It's really cost prohibitive right now unless you absolutely need that much. And with systems with 6 slots, a CPU, I'm sorry, it's 4 gig chips are enough, and they're a hell of a lot cheaper. It's like...
Sure. Well, what is not popular in the Mac versus PC debate is the Apple servers. and OS 10 server, which is...
I'm sorry, I don't mean to bash on them, but they're a joke compared to what else is available.
Well, okay, but what I'm saying is that their hardware scale is different than like the Mac Pro, and OS 10 server is a different animal out of the gate versus the retail version of OS 10. I mean, it is 64 kernel boot automatic, and a lot of the features that you have out of the gate, if you were to buy, the OS 10 server hardware, and thus getting OS 10 Snow Leopard server, you're in a different world, really.
Yeah. That's one thing I've always felt was really artificial, and that I've never I understand why the default out of the box on OS 10 is to boot into 32, but there should be some way to go in there and change the default boot settings. I mean, hell, I can even do that in Windows if I know what I'm doing. I can go in and change the default boot up.
I looked into it though, but other than selecting the kernel, but
I have looked into it, and I have read forums and I've read people who are diehard Apple fans who go in there and go, in the consumer version of OS 10, there is no way to change this. You have to manually specify each and every time you want to boot into 64. Which means if you want to boot into 64-bit every time, you have to do that extra step every single time you boot the computer. Which, that's one of those things will just become annoying. And there's no reason that feature couldn't be there except Apple doesn't want it there.
Well, you said it best in your, I think, what was it, the Mac vs. PC series, where the marginal difference for use of 64-bit isn't really there yet.
Well, no, and that's why I think building into 32 by default is the right choice. But I can see a niche group of OS 10 users who are doing stuff where they truly benefit from 64. They're like, okay, you stupid computer, do not make me do this every time I boot you up. Just boot into it by default. Please, I beg of you. It's like, because, and in those people, they're really being punished for using OS 10.
So you're saying you think Xserve is a joke? Because I find like the Mac Pro to be competitive and Xserve to be competitive in price for other accounts. I think that they're not like buying an iMac or anything like that. I don't.
Here's why I think they're a joke. They're charging, as far as overall price, they're competitive. However, aside from very niche things, I honestly think you're better off to go with the Linux server. And as a result of that, I think the price should be less for it to really be level playing field competitive.
It's tough to be a Linux server model. I mean, that's why Linux is...
I know. Well, and that's the thing. Well, and that's really why I don't see that taking off, because it's Unix versus Linux, not Unix versus Windows. And I'm sorry, in that contest, especially for costs and everything else, it's a joke. An IT admin's going to look at that, and unless they're doing this very niche market thing that OS 10 happens to be the best server for, and there are a few things like that. But unless you're in one of these things, I'm sorry. And the other thing is, like, one of the things Apple wants you to do with OS 10 servers is if you're building an array of servers, they want you to build an all OS 10 array. And I'm sorry, every admin's going to look at that and go, even if I'm doing this niche thing where I need an OS 10 server, I'm going to have the OS 10 server and I'm going to have a Linux farm behind it. There's no way I'm going to put an OS 10 farm behind that. I'm not that touched in the head.